A freight driver named Orrin Bell sat on a flour wagon outside a half-built claim shack 9 miles west of the rail stop and watched a thing he did not want to see. A deputy was tacking a paper to the one solid wall. The nail went in crooked. The wind caught the paper and snapped it flat against the wood before the man could straighten it. In the doorway, a boy stood barefoot on raw dirt, holding a cracked tin cup against his teeth. Behind him, a man with blood-darkened palms stood perfectly still, and the emptiness beside the shack, no woodpile, no tools, no second wall, said everything the paper did not need to. The deputy pulled the nail out and drove it again. His hands were not steady. He did not look at the boy. Milo Harrow reached the quarter-section claim 9 miles west of the rail stop on a Tuesday in late July of 1885, and what he found was not a homestead. It was an excuse for one. His brother-in-law, Dale, had filed the claim receipt in both their names in April, promised to bring the tools and seed money from Dodge City, and then sold the shared mule team for $62 and disappeared east on the morning train without leaving a note. Milo learned this from a freight clerk at the rail stop who remembered Dale because the man had been drunk and laughing about Kansas. So Milo stood in buffalo grass up to his son's chest with one lame mule, $14.30 folded inside a tobacco tin, a cross-cut saw missing half its teeth, no axe, one iron wedge, one cracked cook stove bought from a freighter for $3, and a 9-year-old boy named Asa who had not spoken a full sentence since they buried his mother outside Ellenwood. The claim shack was half a frame. Dale had raised the north and east walls to shoulder height using cottonwood poles and scrap lumber, then quit. The south wall was 4 posts with nothing between them. The west wall did not exist. There was no roof. There was no floor. There was a pile of sod bricks cut crooked and already slumping in the rain, a rusted stovepipe elbow lying in the dirt, and a single cord of green cottonwood that would burn like wet rope and heat like a candle in a cathedral. Milo opened the flour sack. 11 days of cornmeal if he fed Asa full portions and himself half. He looked at the grave 50 yards east of the claim line, where he had buried Nell under a limestone slab so thin the rain was already wearing her name smooth. Then he looked at the claim stake. Asa stood in the doorway that had no door. He held a cracked tin cup against his teeth and said the first full sentence he had spoken in 9 days. "Are we going back to Missouri?" Milo did not answer because the answer was no, and the reason was standing behind them both in a shallow grave, and the boy already knew it. The Homestead Act allowed a man to claim 160 acres of public land if he lived on it and improved it. The claim required proof of residence and habitable improvement, and the local land office in Dodge City had a clerk named Virgil Pruitt who took that requirement seriously. Pruitt had warned Milo during the filing that a cattleman named Claiborne Sutter had been contesting claims along the draw where winter water pooled, and that an obviously abandoned or unlivable claim would not survive a challenge before spring. Milo had until the first proof inspection to show a habitable dwelling. The notice tacked to his half-built walls said the structure must measure at least 12 by 14 feet, have a functional roof, a closable door, and evidence of continuous residence. If it failed inspection, the claim could be contested. If the contest succeeded, Milo lost the land, and without the land, he had nothing. No relatives east of the river who would take a widower with a silent child, no money for passage anywhere, no trade that would hire a man who had failed at tenant farming, failed at mule driving, and failed at the one partnership he had trusted with his family's future. Nell's grave was outside the claim line because Milo had not known where the boundary fell when he dug it. If he abandoned the claim, someone else would file on the quarter section, and Asa would lose the only place on earth where he could stand beside his mother. $14.30, One half-built shack. No axe. No partner. Winter coming in 5 months. The math did not work. Milo knew it did not work. He fed Asa cornmeal mush with the last of the bacon grease and sat in the doorway that had no door and watched the sun go down over land that did not care whether he lived or died on it. Enoch Vale arrived on the 4th morning. He came on a bay horse with a carpenter's belt slung over the saddle horn and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same cottonwood as the claim shack, hard, dry, and cracked in places that suggested long use. Enoch was 58 years old. He had served as quartermaster carpenter at Fort Dodge during the years when the Army built structures meant to stand against Plains winters, and he had seen what happened to structures that did not. He had buried men who froze inside walls they thought were finished. He did not introduce himself. He swung off the horse, tied it to the one solid post, and walked the perimeter of the shack the way a doctor walks around a patient he already knows is dying. Asa watched from inside the half-frame. Milo stood with his hands at his sides, the split skin on his palms dark with dried blood from 3 days of dragging cottonwood poles bare-handed. Enoch kicked the slumping sod bricks. They crumbled. He pressed his thumb into the corner joint where the north and east walls met and the wood gave under his nail. He looked at the stovepipe elbow lying in the dirt, then at the stove with its cracked firebox, then at the single cord of green cottonwood stacked against the east wall. "Who cut this wood?" Enoch asked. "Dale cut it in June," Milo said. "Dale being the man who left." "Yes." Enoch pulled a piece from the stack and held it to his nose. "Green, wet clear through. You could burn this from now until Christmas and it would give you smoke and nothing else." He dropped it. "Where's your axe?" "I do not have an axe." Enoch looked at him for a long time. The wind moved through the open south wall and pushed grit along the dirt floor, and Asa's cup clicked against his teeth. "You have half a frame," Enoch said. He was not angry. He was counting. "You have one stove that leaks smoke through the firebox crack. You have no axe. You have one cord of green cottonwood that is not worth the ground it sits on. You need 6 cords minimum of seasoned wood to survive December through March. You need a tight roof that sheds snow. You need 4 walls that do not breathe." He pointed at the open south side. "You do not have a wall there. You have an invitation." "I know what I have," Milo said. "Do you?" Enoch looked at the grave. He looked at Asa. He looked at the empty horizon where no timber grew for miles in any direction except the cottonwood bottoms along the draw, which Sutter's cattle had already trampled to mud. A serviceable axe in town cost $2.75. Finished boards for a proper cabin would eat your entire cash reserve and leave you nothing for food or nails. Sod is free, but cutting and laying a full sod house alone before hard freeze takes 6 weeks of labor with proper tools, and you do not have proper tools. "I know," Milo said again. Enoch mounted his horse. "Then you know you cannot do this." He rode away without looking back. He was not cruel. He was a man who had counted the numbers and found them impossible, and he did not believe in wasting kindness on mathematics. Milo watched him go. Then he looked at Asa, who had heard every word and understood most of it. "He is right," Asa said quietly. Milo picked up the iron wedge. "He is right about the numbers." "Then what?" Milo did not answer. He walked to the cottonwood stack and began splitting the driest piece he could find, driving the wedge with a stone because he had no maul. Each strike sent a shock through his wrists that he felt in his teeth. The wood split crooked. The halves were too green to burn and too small to build with. But his hands were moving, and moving was the only thing left that was not surrender. 3 days later, a rainstorm hit the claim like a thrown bucket. The half-built shack had no roof. Milo had stretched a canvas tarp over the frame, but the wind tore one corner free within the first hour, and by midnight, the rain was pouring through in sheets that hit the dirt floor and turned it to cold mud. The sod bricks he had restacked along the south wall slumped and ran like brown sugar. The stove sat in 2 inches of water. Asa coughed through the night, curled under a damp blanket on the one dry platform Milo had built from scrap boards raised on stones. Milo sat in the mud and held the tarp corner with his bare hands because there was nothing else to hold it with, and the rain ran down his arms and pooled in his lap, and he thought about every decision that had led him to this particular piece of darkness on this particular night, on this particular land that was trying to drown his son. At dawn, the rain stopped. The world smelled like wet iron and rot. The canvas hung in a heavy sag full of brown water. The flour sack had taken moisture. 5 days of meal ruined. Milo dumped the spoiled flour into the mud and did not curse because Asa was watching. He needed to find something he could sell. Dropped spikes, scrap iron, anything the railroad crews had left behind. The abandoned contractor siding sat 3 miles south, where a drainage washout had made a planned spur uneconomical, and the Santa Fe had left behind whatever was not worth hauling back to Dodge City. Milo walked the 3 miles in boots that squelched. The abandoned grade was a shallow cut through the prairie, overgrown with buffalo grass, the old roadbed still visible as a pale scar in the earth. Spike holes dotted the rotting cross ties. A few bent spikes lay in the weeds. He gathered 7 and put them in his coat pocket. Then he sat down on a railroad tie to rest. The tie was black, not weathered gray like the cottonwood in his shack, but deep, wet black, the color of coal tar. The creosote smell rose from it in the morning heat, sharp, chemical, unmistakable. The tie was oak, 7 inches by 9 inches by 8.5 feet long, and it was heavy enough that Milo could not lift one end higher than his waist. He sat on it and felt the hardness beneath him and noticed something. The ground under the tie was dry, not damp, not muddy, dry, powder dry. The rain that had soaked every other surface on the prairie, the rain that had ruined his flour and filled his shack with mud, had not reached the ground beneath the single creosote-treated railroad tie. Milo rolled off the tie and crouched beside it. He worked the iron wedge under one end and levered it up 6 inches. The earth beneath was dust, pale, fine, undisturbed dust, as if it had not rained at all. He looked at the mud surrounding the tie on all sides. Thick, dark, saturated, and then at the dry island beneath it, and something turned over in his mind. He pressed his palm flat against the underside of the tie. Dry. He pressed his palm against the top. Wet, but the water sat on the surface in beads. It had not soaked through. The creosote had sealed the wood so thoroughly that rain could not enter it. The tar had made the timber waterproof. And then he heard his mother's voice. Not literally, not a ghost or a vision. A memory, sharp as a nail driven into soft wood. He was 7 years old, standing in a river shed outside Jefferson City while rain hammered the tin roof, watching his mother press warm tarred oakum into the seams of a leaking wall. Her sleeves were wet wool. Her thumb was black with pitch. She worked the oakum into each gap with her knuckle, pressing until the wet stopped. "Feel that," she said, and put his hand flat against the sealed seam. The rain still pounded outside, but the wall was dry beneath his palm. Wind quits where water quits. You seal the water. You seal everything. Milo crouched beside the railroad tie in the Kansas mud and felt the dry ground beneath it and understood. The ties were not just lumber. They were squared, heavy, uniform, and sealed against water. The creosote that made them poisonous to termites and rot also made them proof against rain, snow, and the freezing moisture that killed settlers by turning their cabin walls into conductors of cold. The ties were already cut to consistent dimensions. They did not need to be sawed or hewn. They did not require an axe. And there were hundreds of them sitting in the abandoned grade, stacked beside the shallow cut, left behind because no one wanted to pay the freight to haul treated oak ties back to a rail yard that already had enough. The logic built itself in his mind like the courses of a wall. He could not build a proper cabin. He had no axe, no finished lumber, no money for materials. But he could keep the small inner dwelling, the 12 by 14 room the land office required, and surround it with an exterior shell made of stacked railroad ties. The ties would block wind. They would shed water. Their sheer mass would slow the passage of cold through the walls, the way a stone cellar stays cool in summer and warm in winter. The air gap between the inner room and the outer tie shell would act as dead space, trapping still air that conducted heat poorly. He did not know the word insulation. He did not need it. He knew what his mother had taught him. Wind quits where water quits. And he knew what sitting on that tie had shown him. Water quit at creosote. The design formed. The inner room, 12 by 14, built from the existing frame, scrap planks, sod knee wall, clay-daubed seams, roofed with salvaged boards and sod. Around it, a 16 by 18 exterior tie shell, stacked 6 feet high, cribbed at the corners, chinked with clay and ash and chopped grass, separated from the stove by a mud-plastered air gap lined with scrap sheet iron. He would need roughly 240 usable ties. Each weighed between 180 and 220 pounds. The siding was 3 miles away. He had one lame mule, no wagon, and no help. The risk was total. If he spent the rest of summer and fall hauling ties and the idea failed, he would have no sod house, no woodpile, and no time to build anything else before the ground froze. Every hour spent on the tie shell was an hour stolen from the conventional path that at least had precedent, even if precedent said he would probably fail at that too. But the conventional path required an axe he could not buy, timber he could not reach, labor he did not have, and roof beams that cost more than everything in his tobacco tin. One impossible labor in exchange for one possible shelter, or one conventional labor that was also impossible, just slower about admitting it. Milo picked up a bent spike from the weeds and put it in his pocket with the others. He looked at the rows of black ties stacked along the grade. He counted as far as he could see. More than enough. Then he walked back to the claim in wet boots, and when Asa asked what he had found, Milo said, "Wood." Ruel Tandy arrived 2 days later. Ruel was the nearest neighbor, 3 miles northeast, a practical man of 42 with a sod house, 4 children, a wife who could split wood faster than he could, and the settled disposition of someone who had already survived 2 Kansas winters and did not intend to be surprised by a third. He came to check on the new settler because that was what neighbors did, and because his wife had told him that a man alone with a boy and no axe was either going to need help or going to die, and either way, Ruel should know about it first. He found Milo levering the first railroad tie onto a crude skid made from 2 cottonwood poles. The tie was black and wet and smelled like a rail yard in August. Milo's shirt was soaked through. His boots were caked with mud from the grade. He had dragged the tie 3 miles using the lame mule and a rope harness, and the mule was standing with its head down and its sides heaving. Ruel watched for a while. Then he walked over and looked at the tie, and then at the half-built shack, and then at Milo, and his expression shifted from curiosity to something closer to concern. What are you doing with that? Ruel asked. Building a wall. Out of railroad ties. Yes. Ruel crouched and pressed his hand against the tie. He pulled it away and looked at the black residue on his palm. These things are track trash, Harrow. They are too heavy to lift, too crooked to build with, and too foul to sleep beside. A man cannot raise walls from creosote timber. The smell alone will drive you out before December. Milo did not argue. He crouched beside the tie and drove the iron wedge under one edge, then levered it up and showed Ruel the ground beneath. Dry. Ruel touched the dry earth. He rubbed it between his fingers. He looked at the mud everywhere else, then back at the pale dust under the tie. Dry dirt under one beam will not warm a boy in January, Ruel said. No, Milo said, but 240 of them might. Ruel stood up. He wiped his hand on his trousers and looked at the shack frame with no south wall and the stovepipe lying in the dirt, and the boy sitting on the scrapboard platform inside, reading the same page of a feed store almanac he had been reading for a week. You are going to haul 240 railroad ties 3 miles with a lame mule and stack them around that, Ruel said. Yes, alone, unless someone offers. Ruel did not offer. He shook his head and walked back to his horse. Before he mounted, he turned and said, A man alone cannot build winter walls after August, Harrow. Not from sod, not from timber, and sure as hell not from railroad trash. Milo did not answer. He wedged the pry pole under the tie, rocked it 6 inches forward on the skids, and kept counting under his breath. The general store at the rail stop was a single room with a plank counter, a pot-bellied stove, and a window that faced the tracks. It was where men gathered in the late afternoon to trade gossip the way they traded anything else, carelessly, with no thought for who got damaged in the exchange. Within a week, everyone within 10 miles knew about Harrow's project. The storekeeper, a man named Loomis, told the story to every customer. New fellow west of the draw is hauling railroad ties around his shack like he's building a fort. His boy sits inside and watches. The mule looks half dead. Children along the road called the place Harrow's Tar Pen. Men laughed at the black stains on Milo's trousers when he came to town for salt and nails. Women looked at Asa with the particular pity reserved for children whose fathers have made decisions that will be discussed at their funerals. But the man who watched most carefully did not laugh. Claiborne Sutter was 46 years old, a cattle buyer and land speculator who had spent a decade assembling grazing access along the draw, where winter water pooled in shallow depressions the cattle could reach even when the creeks froze. He was not a villain. He was a businessman who understood that land near water was worth more than land without it, and that a quarter-section claim on the draw was worth contesting if the claimant could not prove residence. Sutter had no need to kill Milo Harrow. He only needed Milo to quit. The first time they met, it was outside the general store. Milo was loading bent spikes and a sack of limesite from a burned-out section house into a canvas bag. Sutter stood on the porch with a cigar that cost more than Milo's daily food budget and watched him work. You planning to farm, Harrow? Sutter asked. Or open a graveyard for railroad lumber? Ruel Tandy was there. He laughed before he could stop himself. Then he saw Asa standing behind the wagon wheel, and the laugh died in his throat like a spark on wet wood. Milo straightened. He looked at Sutter the way a man looks at a fence he knows he cannot go around. A graveyard has quiet ground, Milo said. Sutter stepped off the porch. He was taller than Milo and wore boots that had been oiled within the week. So does a failed claim. He dropped his cigar and ground it under his heel. A man who lives in railroad waste is not improving land. He is littering it. The land office does not give title for junk. Milo said nothing. He picked up the canvas bag and walked to the mule. Sutter raised his voice so that Loomis and Ruel and the two section hands loitering near the tracks could all hear. I have spoken with Virgil Pruitt at the land office. A ring of used railroad ties is not a habitable structure. It is a nuisance. And if it is a nuisance, the claim is contestable. Milo loaded the bag onto the mule. He checked the rope. He took Asa's hand, and they walked west along the road without turning around. Behind them, Sutter told Ruel, "That man will be gone by first frost. The only question is whether he leaves the mess for someone else to clean up." Ruel said nothing, but that night he told his wife about the dry ground under the railroad tie, and he could not explain why the image stayed with him. That same night, inside the half-roofed shack, Asa asked why they did not build like everyone else. Milo took his son's hand and pressed it flat against the inner wall, where the rain had soaked through the plank and the sod and left a dark, wet stain that would not dry. The wood was cold and slick under the boy's fingers. Then Milo took Asa's other hand and pressed it against the railroad tie he had dragged inside as a test weight and leaned against the east wall. The surface was dry, cool, but not cold. The creosote had sealed it so completely that the moisture in the air could not enter the grain. "Because everyone else has what we do not," Milo said, "and we have what they do not see." Asa pulled his hand away from the wet wall and left it on the tie. He did not say anything, but he stopped asking about Missouri. Construction began on the first day of August, and it began with pain. The abandoned siding was 3 miles south. Each usable tie weighed between 180 and 220 pounds, depending on how much moisture the oak had absorbed and how deeply the creosote had penetrated the grain. Milo could not lift a tie. No single man could lift a tie and carry it 3 miles. The lame mule could drag one tie on the cottonwood pole skids at a pace slower than walking, and the rope harness cut sores into the animal's shoulders within the first week. Milo made 2 trips a day when the mule held up, 1 trip in the early morning before the August heat turned the prairie into a griddle, 1 trip in the late afternoon when the shadows stretched long enough that the air cooled a degree or two. Each round trip took between 3 and 4 hours, depending on the mud and the mule's temper, and whether the tie caught on a stone or a root and had to be levered free with the iron wedge. By the end of the first week, he had moved 12 ties. He needed 240. The math was terrible. At 12 ties a week, he would need 20 weeks. 20 weeks from the 1st of August was late December. The first hard freeze could come in November. The first blizzard could come before Christmas. He would be stacking ties in snow if he was stacking ties at all, if the mule survived, if his body survived, if Asa did not get sick, if the flour lasted. He did not do the math in front of Asa. He did it at night, scratching numbers into the dirt floor with a nail, erasing them with his boot before the boy woke up. $14.30. He spent $2 on nails and salt at the store, $12.30 remaining. An axe cost $2.75. He did not buy the axe. He needed the money for flour when the cornmeal ran out. By September 1st, he had moved 28 ties. The first course was laid on 2 sides, north and east, set on flat limestone rocks and gravel that he had carried from the draw in a canvas sling. The ties sat level and dark against the pale grass, and from a distance the half-built shack looked like it was growing a black scar. Milo's palms were split, not blistered. The blisters had come and gone in the first week. The skin beneath had cracked along the lines where the rope pulled, and the cracks had deepened until they bled when he closed his fists. He wrapped them in strips of Nell's old dress that he had been saving for Asa's winter padding, and the cloth turned brown and stiff by afternoon. By September 15th, 62 ties were in place. The mule's harness had been repaired twice with wire and leather scraps. The north wall stood waist high on the outside, and when Milo pressed his back against the inner shack wall and looked up at the black ties rising beyond it, he could feel something that was not yet warmth, but was the absence of wind. The first cool night came on September 20th. The temperature dropped enough that Asa's breath showed white inside the shack at dawn. Milo lit the stove for the first time. The cracked firebox leaked smoke, and the green cottonwood sizzled and popped and threw more steam than heat. But on the north side, where the ties were stacked to the height of a man's chest, the smoke drifted straight up. On the south side, where the wall was still open to the sky, the smoke bent sideways and vanished into the prairie wind. The ties were already doing something, but the south wall was empty, and the west wall had only one course. And the roof was still canvas and prayer, and the first frost was coming, and Milo had 178 ties left to move with a mule that flinched every time he reached for the harness. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Because Milo had no proof yet, only the wall, the cold, and the people waiting for both to fail. He could not move fast enough. The days were getting shorter. The grass was turning from green to brown to the pale gold that meant the roots were pulling everything underground, which meant the soil would harden soon, which meant the gravel trench he still needed to dig around the foundation would require twice the labor once the frost set in. And somewhere in Dodge City, Claiborne Sutter was writing a letter to a land agent, and the letter said that the Harrow claim showed no evidence of habitable improvement, and that the structure being erected was not a dwelling but a public nuisance assembled from stolen railroad property. Milo did not know about the letter. He knew about the wind. He knew about the 93 days until January. He knew about the 178 ties still sitting in the abandoned grade, black and heavy and waiting, each one a small promise that he could not yet keep. He picked up the rope. He called the mule. The animal came slowly, limping on the right foreleg, and Milo checked the shoulder sores and rubbed axle grease into the raw spots and told the mule he was sorry in a voice so quiet that Asa, watching from the doorway, could not hear the words. Then they walked south toward the grade, and the shadow of the half-built wall stretched behind them in the late afternoon light. And it was not long enough yet, not high enough yet, not thick enough yet, and winter did not wait for men who were not ready. By October 1st, 110 ties were in place. The north wall stood at full height, 6 feet of black oak stacked in alternating courses, the ends overlapping at the northeast corner in a crude crib pattern that Milo had copied from the way the ties were stacked at the siding. The east wall was chest high. The west and south walls were knee-high and gapped, and the wind came through them at night like water through a sieve. Milo had lost 8 pounds since August. He knew this because his belt had moved 2 holes, and his trousers hung from his hips like cloth on a fence post. His palms had stopped bleeding and started building calluses that cracked at the edges like dried mud. The mule's right foreleg had swollen at the fetlock, and the animal could no longer drag a full tie without stopping every 50 yards to stand with its head down, breathing in the short, sharp gasps of a creature working past its own limits. On October 3rd, the mule collapsed. It went down on the grade road halfway between the siding and the claim, still harnessed to a 200-pound oak tie, and it did not get up. Milo unhitched the harness and sat beside the animal and put his hand on its neck and felt the pulse hammering beneath the hide, fast and shallow and wrong. The mule's eyes were half closed. Foam streaked its jaw. Milo left the tie on the road and walked the mule back to the claim without a load. He pulled the harness sores clean with water and packed them with tallow, and set the animal in the lee of the north wall, where the wind could not reach it. The mule stood with its bad leg lifted and did not eat. For 4 days, Milo moved ties by hand. He could not carry them. He could roll them, using the iron wedge as a lever and two cottonwood poles as tracks. But the poles sank into soft ground, and the ties slid off, and the whole process covered about 200 yards an hour. In 4 days, he moved 6 ties. His shoulders felt like someone had driven nails into the joints. He slept in 2-hour intervals because his back seized if he lay flat for longer. On the morning of the 5th day, a man appeared on the grade road. He was tall and lean and walked with a limp that favored his left side, as if the right leg had been shortened by something heavy falling on it a long time ago. He wore a canvas coat stained with pine pitch and carried a cant hook over one shoulder, the way a soldier carries a rifle. Balanced, familiar, part of the body. His hair was white at the temples, and his face was brown from decades of outdoor work, and he was angry. "You," the man said, pointing the cant hook at Milo. "You are the one pulling spikes from the siding." Milo straightened from the tie he had been rolling. His back screamed. "I have not pulled any spikes. I found loose ones in the grass." "You are moving ties." "Yes." "You're moving them wrong." The man walked past Milo to the tie on the road. He crouched, painfully, the bad leg extending stiff, and examined the spike holes. He ran his thumb along the creosote surface. He looked at the cottonwood poles Milo was using as skids and shook his head slowly, the way a carpenter shakes his head at a joint made with a dull blade. "You are dragging the flat face," the man said. "You are tearing the spike holes open. Every hole you ruin is a pin seat lost. You drag on the narrow face, the 9-inch face down, the 7-inch face forward. The wood slides on the tar." Milo stared at him. "Who are you?" "Tolif Asen." He said it like a fact, not an introduction. "I built bridge cribbing in Wisconsin for the Chicago and Northwestern before my foot went under a dropped stringer. Then I repaired section in Kansas until my leg told me I was finished." He pointed the cant hook at the tie again. "Those are mine. I laid most of the siding ties before the drainage washed out. I do not care that you take them. I care that you waste them." Tolif walked the length of the tie. He measured the spike holes with his eye. He pressed the cant hook into the end grain and twisted, testing the density. Then he looked at the half-built wall visible from the road, the black rectangle rising from the prairie like a strange ruin, and his expression changed from anger to something Milo could not read. "You are building a shell," Tolif said. "Yes." "Around a dwelling." "Yes." "With railroad ties." "Yes." Tolif looked at the lever fulcrum Milo had built from a flat limestone slab and a broken wagon hub. The fulcrum was crude, but it worked. The hub acted as a rolling pivot that let Milo multiply force against the tie's weight. Tolif studied it for a long time. The wind moved across the grade and carried creosote smell and dust. "You do not lift stupid," Tolif said finally. "You lift poor. Poor can be taught." He set the cant hook against the tie, rolled it onto its narrow face with a single practiced motion, and began showing Milo how to move weight without destroying himself. The first thing Tolif taught was the skid system, not the crude cottonwood poles Milo had been using, which sank and split and caught on every stone. Tolif cut 2 straight poles from the cottonwood bottom, selecting wood that was dry, slim, and hard, and shaved the bark with a draw knife he carried in his coat. Then he rubbed the bare wood with tallow until the surface was slick as river ice. "Grease," Tolif said. "A grease skid carries what a dry skid fights." He laid the 2 poles parallel on the ground 12 inches apart and rolled the tie onto them. Then he looped a rope around the tie's end and ran it to a buried post 20 yards ahead. a cottonwood stump Milo had been using as a chopping block. Tolliff wrapped the rope 3 times around the stump in a capstan hitch. "Pull," he said. Milo pulled. The tie moved, not with the grinding, sucking resistance of bare wood on dirt, but with a slow, heavy slide that felt like pushing a loaded sled on snow. The tallow on the skid rails let the creosote surface glide. The capstan wrap multiplied Milo's pulling force. The tie traveled 20 yards in the time it would have taken Milo to roll it 5. "Again," Tolliff said. He reset the rope around a stone he had driven into the ground with the cant hook. "Every 20 yards, a new anchor. Leapfrog the posts. The tie never stops moving." By the end of that first day, Milo moved 4 ties from the siding to the claim. 4 ties in one day. His previous best had been 2, and that had cost him the mule's health and his own back. Tolliff did not help carry. His leg would not allow it. He walked beside Milo and corrected the angle of the skids and adjusted the rope tension and told him when he was wasting motion. He taught the way a foreman teaches. Through correction, not encouragement. You pull with your legs, not your arms. Your arms are rope. Your legs are the engine. You reset the skids before you move the next tie. Never drag a tie onto unprepared ground. The time you save dragging, you lose digging it out of mud. Stop. Feel the rope. Is it singing or sagging? Singing means the load is moving. Sagging means something caught. Find the catch before you pull harder, or you break the rope and start from nothing. The second thing Tolliff taught was cribbed corners. He arrived the next morning before dawn, and when Milo came out of the shack with Asa trailing behind him, Tolliff was standing at the northeast corner of the tie shell, examining Milo's work with the expression of a man reading a letter full of spelling errors. "This will fall," Tolliff said. He pointed at the corner where the north and east walls met. Milo had stacked the ties with their ends butted against each other, relying on weight alone to hold them in place. Weight holds a wall down. It does not hold a corner together. When the ground freezes and heaves, the corner opens. When the wind loads snow against one side, the corner pushes. You need the ties to lock. He pulled 3 ties from the top course and restacked them so that each course alternated direction at the corner. The north wall's tie extending past the east wall on one course, the east wall's tie extending past the north wall on the next. The overlapping ends interlocked like fingers lacing together. "Cribbing," Tolliff said. "Every bridge I built used this. The wood holds itself. You are not fighting it. You are letting the weight do what weight wants to do, which is settle and grip." He made Milo tear down the northeast corner and rebuild it. 3 hours of work, undone and redone. Milo's jaw was tight and his hands shook, but when the corner was restacked in the crib pattern, he pushed against it with both hands. It did not move. The butted corner had shifted under the same pressure. "Now do the others," Tolliff said. The third thing Tolliff taught was drainage. He arrived on the 4th morning with a shovel that had been sharpened so many times the blade was narrow as a trowel. He walked the perimeter of the tie shell and stopped at the southeast corner, where rain had pooled against the first course and frozen overnight into a thin crust of ice. "This will kill you," Tolliff said. He kicked the ice. Not the cold, the water. Water freezes under the first course, expands, lifts the tie, and opens every seam above it. By January, the wall will lean. By February, it will fall. You must move the water before it freezes. He made Milo dig a shallow trench around the entire foundation, 8 inches deep, 8 inches wide, filled with gravel and limestone chips that Milo hauled from the draw in canvas slings. The trench sloped away from the walls on all sides so that rain and snowmelt drained outward instead of pooling against the ties. It took 5 days. 5 days Milo could not spend hauling ties. He felt a calendar burning. You have time to dig or time to freeze, Tolef said. Choose. By October 20th, 160 ties were in place. The north and east walls stood at full height, cribbed at the corners, sitting on gravel-drained foundation trenches. The west wall was chest high. The south wall was waist high and gapped where Milo had run out of ties that fit the course without cutting. The first frost came on October 18th. Buffalo grass turned silver at dawn and did not thaw until noon. Asa wore every piece of clothing he owned and still shivered. Milo's money stood at $9.40. The cornmeal was nearly gone. He bought 10 pounds of flour, 2 pounds of salt pork, and a small sack of dried beans from Loomis at the general store. The purchase cost $3.15. He had $6.25 remaining. Loomis watched him count the coins on the counter. Sutter was in here yesterday, Loomis said. He told Virgil Pruitt your place is not a dwelling. He called it a fire hazard. Milo pocketed the change. Is it? Creosote burns hot, Harrow. If that stove throws a spark into those walls. The stove is not against the walls. Loomis shrugged. I'm telling you what he said. Milo carried the food back to the claim and did not tell Asa about Sutter's new angle. The boy had enough weight on him without adding the knowledge that a man they had never wronged was trying to take their home before it was even built. That night, Tolef showed him the fourth lesson, safe stove separation. They built a heat shield between the inner shack wall and the stovepipe using mud plaster, scrap tin from an old section house roof, and flat stones set in clay. The shield stood 18 inches from the nearest tie and 12 inches from the stovepipe. Tolef made Milo pack the clay 2 inches thick and press sheets of tin into the wet surface so that any spark or radiant heat would hit metal and stone before it reached treated wood. Black wood is not hearthwood, Tolef said. You do not burn it. You do not lean kindling against it. You do not let the pipe touch it. The creosote in those ties will burn like a torch if flame reaches it, and once it starts, water will not stop it because the tar resists water. That is why it works as a wall. That is why it kills as a fire. He made Asa repeat the rule. The boy recited it twice, his voice thin but certain. The black wood does not touch the fire. The fire does not touch the black wood. Good, Tolef said. Remember it when your father forgets. The fifth thing Tolef taught came on a still evening in early November, when the wind died and the prairie went quiet the way it goes quiet before something arrives. Tolef produced a candle stub from his coat pocket. He lit it and held it near the seam between 2 ties on the north wall. The flame bent sideways, a tiny, unmistakable deflection toward the interior. There, Tolef said. Wind. He moved the candle along the seam. The flame straightened where the clay chinking was solid and bent where it was not. Each deflection marked a gap invisible to the eye, but legible to the flame. You do not seal what looks wrong, Tolef said. You seal what the fire tells you. The candle does not lie. Your eyes do. They spent 3 hours walking the entire perimeter with the candle, marking every draft with a scratch in the clay, then going back and filling each one with fresh chinking, a mix of clay, sand, ash, chopped grass, and limesite that Tolef showed Milo how to blend into a paste that dried hard and did not crack in cold. When they finished, Tolef held the candle to the same seam. The flame stood straight. Milo pressed his palm against the wall. No air moved through it. Wind quits where water quits, Milo said. Tolef looked at him sharply. Who told you that? My mother. Tolef nodded slowly. Your mother knew timber. The setbacks came in clusters, the way trouble always does when a man is already stretched past breaking. In late October, rain turned the grade road into grease. Milo was hauling a tie on the skid system when the left rail sank into soft ground and the tie slid sideways. It caught Milo's boot between the tie and a limestone outcrop. He could not pull free. The weight pressed down on his foot with the patient, terrible force of 200 pounds that had nowhere else to go. Asa was at the claim. The grade was empty. Milo dug at the mud around his boot with his fingers until his nails bent backward, then used the iron wedge to lever the tie up a quarter-inch, enough to pull his foot free. His boot was crushed flat on one side. His toes were bruised but not broken. He sat in the mud for 20 minutes, holding his foot and shaking before he could stand. He did not tell Tolliff. Tolliff found out anyway because Milo limped for a week. You work alone on the grade again and the tie kills you instead of crippling you, Tolliff said. Then the boy's alone. Milo said nothing because Tolliff was right, and because the image of Asa alone on the claim with a dead father and a dying mule and winter coming was the one picture his mind produced every night before sleep. In early November, Sutter sent a deputy clerk named Fenton to the claim. Fenton was 23 and uncomfortable. He walked the perimeter of the tie shell with a notebook and sketched the structure from 2 angles and wrote measurements in pencil. He did not look at Milo or Asa. "What is this for?" Milo asked. "Mr. Sutter has filed preliminary contest papers," Fenton said. "He argues that the structure does not constitute habitable improvement. There is a dwelling inside the ties, 12 by 14, roof, door, stove." Fenton wrote something in his notebook. "I will note that." He left. Milo watched him ride east toward Dodge City and felt the ground shift beneath him in a way that had nothing to do with frost. A week after Fenton's visit, the south corner dropped 2 inches. A slow, grinding settlement that opened a gap between the second and third courses wide enough to fit a fist through. The freeze-thaw cycle had heaved the ground beneath the foundation stones despite the drainage trench, because Milo had laid the south corner on soil that was softer than the rest. A patch of old buffalo wallow where the earth held moisture like a sponge. Tolliff saw it from 50 yards away. He walked to the corner and pressed his hand against the gap and felt cold air streaming through it, like breath. "Tear it down," Tolliff said. "I cannot lose the time." "You will lose the wall. Tear it down. Dig deeper. Lay stone, not dirt. Rebuild." Milo tore down 30 ties. 5 days of stacking undone in an afternoon. He dug the foundation trench down another 6 inches, filled it with flat stones from the draw, packed gravel around the stones, and restacked the corner. The rebuilt section took 4 days. 9 days lost in total. 9 days he did not have. By Thanksgiving, the last Thursday of November, 237 ties were in place. The shell was nearly complete, but the south wall still lacked the top course in one section, and the doorway crib was unfinished, and the roof over the air gap between the inner room and the outer shell was nothing but canvas stretched over cottonwood poles. And then something happened that Milo had not earned and did not expect. Ruel Tandy arrived at midnight with his 2 oldest sons and a spare block and tackle. "I am not here because I believe in your tar wall," Ruel said. He did not dismount. His sons stood behind him with the rope and tackle slung between them like a stretcher. "I am here because I do not want to watch a boy freeze while his father stacks junk in the dark." Milo looked at the block and tackle. It was the kind of tool that turned a 2-man job into a 1-man job, and a 1-man job into something that could be done by a child. "Thank you," Milo said. "Do not thank me. My wife sent me. She said if the boy dies and I did nothing, she will not speak to me until spring, and a Kansas winter without a wife talking is worse than any blizzard. They worked through the night. Ruel's boys hauled ties from the staging area where Milo had stockpiled the last loads, and the block and tackle lifted them to the top course. By dawn, 12 ties were placed. The south wall was complete. The doorway crib lacked only the lintel tie, and Ruel's oldest boy, who was 15 and had the arms of a grown man, helped Milo slide it into place, while Tolliff directed from below, shouting corrections in a mix of English and Norwegian that no one fully understood but everyone obeyed. Ruel left before sunrise. He did not shake Milo's hand. He looked at the finished shell, 6 feet of black oak surrounding the small inner room on all 4 sides, cribbed at every corner, chinked with clay and ash, separated from the stove by mud plaster and scrap tin, and shook his head. "It still smells like a rail yard," Ruel said, "and it looks like something a lunatic would build." "Yes," Milo said, "but I will say this, the wind does not come through it." He rode away with his sons. Milo stood in the doorway and watched the first gray light of November catch the black walls and turn them silver at the edges where frost was forming on the creosote surface. The frost did not penetrate. It sat on top of the tar like sugar on a burned cake, and the wood beneath stayed dry. By mid-December, the tie shell was complete. The outer wall stood 6 feet high on 3 sides and 5.5 feet on the south, where the rebuilt corner had come out slightly lower. The roof was not elegant. Cottonwood poles laid across the gap between inner shack and outer shell, covered with salvaged plank, a layer of sod, and tarred canvas scraps from a freight wagon that Milo had traded 2 days of fence work to obtain. The inner room measured 12 by 14 feet, tight enough that Milo and Asa could touch opposite walls with outstretched arms. The stove sat against the east wall with the heat shield between it and the nearest tie. The stovepipe rose through the inner roof and bent through the gap and exited through the outer roof via a tin collar that Tolliff had fashioned from a section of discarded flue. On a night in early December, when the temperature outside fell below 10 degrees, Milo burned 1 small armload of cottonwood, just 5 splits, arranged in the firebox in the pattern Tolliff had shown him, a loose stack that let air circulate beneath the wood so it burned slow and even instead of fast and wasteful. He kept the stove door closed. He checked the cloth strips Tolliff had made him hang from the ceiling near the seams, narrow ribbons of old flour sacking that would flutter in the slightest draft. They hung still. By midnight, the room was not warm. Milo would never call it warm, but the air inside the tie shell held a temperature that did not hurt to breathe. The walls did not radiate cold the way the open shack had. The water bucket near the door formed a skin of ice on the surface, thin as paper, but the water beneath was liquid. Against the far wall, where Asa slept on the raised platform, the bucket Milo had placed as a test showed no ice at all. At dawn, he scratched the result into the door frame with a nail. 1 armload, bucket not hard. Enoch Vale arrived that morning. He had not come to praise. He had come because a man he respected in town had mentioned that Harrow's shack had not collapsed yet, and Enoch was the kind of man who verified claims with his own hands. He tied his horse outside the tie shell and walked through the crib doorway and stood inside the room and looked at the ceiling and the walls and the stove and the bucket near the door. He pressed his hand against the inner wall. Dry. He pressed his hand against a tie visible through the gap. Cold, but not frost-coated. He looked at the water bucket. He saw the thin skin of ice near the door. He walked to the far bucket and tilted it. Liquid. His face did not change. 1 still night is not a blizzard, Enoch said. No, Milo said. A still night below 10 degrees with no wind is the easiest test Kansas gives. The test that matters is 40 below with a north wind packing snow against your wall for 3 days. I know. Do you have enough wood? 4 cords of cottonwood, mixed with some hedge and elm I traded labor for. A leaky shack burns 6 cords in a hard winter. How many will this burn? I do not know yet. Enoch looked at the cloth strips hanging still from the ceiling. He flicked one with his finger. It swung and settled. No draft. Your coroner's hold, he said. It was not a compliment. It was an observation. He left without saying whether he expected Milo to live or die, because Enoch Vale was honest, and honest men do not guess at weather. Tolef came that evening with a mood that Milo had learned to recognize, the quiet that came before a warning. The air is wrong, Tolef said. He stood outside the tie shell and faced north. The sky was clear, the stars hard and bright, and the temperature had risen 5 degrees since noon, a warmth that had no business arriving in mid-December on the Kansas plains. False warm, Tolef said. Before Wisconsin blizzards, the air would soften. The wind would swing south. The old men would go quiet. Then the sky would change color, and the color was the last thing you saw before the white. He made Milo check every seam with the candle. 3 small drafts found and sealed. He made Milo inventory the woodpile. 4 cords of mixed cottonwood, hedge, and elm, stacked tight in the lee of the east wall, covered with canvas. He made Asa fill every container they owned with water. The 2 buckets, the cook pot, a tin can, a cracked jug that held half a gallon. If the snow comes heavy, you cannot reach the well, Tolef said. The water inside is the water you have. He made Milo stuff rags around the door frame and weight the bottom of the door with a flat stone. He checked the stovepipe collar where it passed through the roof and packed fresh clay around the edges. Then he sat down on the sleeping platform next to Asa and taught the boy a counting game. For every split of wood the stove consumed, Asa would make a mark on the wall with charcoal. You count the fire, Tolef told him. The fire does not count itself. That is your job. He left at dark. The air was still warm. The stars were still bright. And to the north, so far away that only a man who had seen it before would notice, the horizon had begun to darken from blue to a color that had no name. The blizzard of January, 1886, began with a lie. New Year's Day dawned mild. The temperature hovered near freezing, and the south wind carried a softness that smelled like distant rain. Asa played outside without mittens for the first time in weeks, throwing stones at a fence post Milo had set as a target. Milo considered using the false warmth to haul one last tie from the siding, a spare he wanted for the vestibule Tolef had been planning. Tolef arrived at 11 in the morning. He did not speak. He stood outside the tie shell and looked at the northern sky, and Milo saw his face and understood that the conversation was over. Inside, Tolef said, now. The front came faster than Milo could secure the mule. The south wind died as if someone had shut a door, and the air went still for a span of seconds that felt like the pause between a hammer's rise and its fall. Then the north wind arrived. It did not build. It struck. One moment the air was calm, and the temperature was 32 degrees. 10 minutes later, the temperature was 16 degrees and dropping, and the wind was driving freezing rain sideways across the prairie in sheets that sounded like gravel hitting stone. The mule screamed. Milo got the animal behind the east wall of the tie shell and tied it short to a post with a canvas tarp pulled over its back. The rain hit his face and froze on contact. Ice formed on his eyebrows between the door and the mule. By noon, the rain had turned to hard pellets of snow. By 1 o'clock, The snow was horizontal. By 2 o'clock, the world outside the tie shell had vanished into a white wall that roared. Inside, Milo closed the door and weighted it with the flat stone and stuffed the rags around the frame. Tolliff was already there. He had not gone home. He had been standing in the yard when the front hit, and the front had decided for him. Asa sat on the sleeping platform with the charcoal in his hand, ready to count. The first hour was the test of faith. The wind hit the north wall with a force that Milo could feel through the floor. Not a gust, a sustained pressure, as if the prairie itself had leaned against the ties and was pushing. The cloth strips near the north seams trembled. One near the upper corner fluttered once and went still. Milo watched it the way a man watches a crack in a dam. "The chinking holds," Tolliff said. He was sitting on the floor with his bad leg extended, calm as a man in a church pew. "If it holds the first hour, it holds the night. The clay needs to set against pressure. Once it sets, it locks." The stove burned low, one split every 40 minutes. Asa made his marks on the wall in a neat row. The room temperature held above freezing, not warm, not comfortable, but breathable. The water bucket near the door formed its skin of ice. The bucket against the far wall stayed clear. Outside, the wind found every surface and tried to tear it. Snow packed against the north wall in a drift that rose an inch every 20 minutes. Milo could hear it, not the wind itself, but the hiss of snow particles hitting creosote timber, a sound like sand running through a sieve. The tie shell took the sound and dampened it. Inside, the roar became a hum. At 4 o'clock, someone pounded on the door. Milo opened it against the wind and a wall of snow fell inward. Behind it stood Ruel Tandy's oldest boy, Lem, 16 years old, ice in his hair, his coat frozen stiff, his bare hands red and cracking. The boy had walked 2 miles in the blizzard. He had followed the low line of the abandoned grade because the open prairie had disappeared, and the grade cut was the only landmark left that he could feel with his feet. "Elsie," the boy said. He was shaking so hard the word broke into pieces. "Elsie is sick. The roof is leaking. Pa tried to reach town, but the road is gone. Ma says, 'Come if you can.' She says the baby cannot breathe." Elsie Tandy was 4 years old and had been coughing for a week. Lung fever. The sod house roof had begun leaking meltwater from the first warm spell, and now the meltwater was freezing inside the house, coating the walls with ice, and the temperature inside the Tandy sod house was dropping toward the temperature outside. Milo looked at Tolliff. Tolliff looked at the door, where heat was already streaming past the boy's body into the white void outside. Every second the door stayed open cost them warmth they could not replace. "Close the door," Tolliff said. "Then decide." Milo closed the door. He put Lem beside the stove and wrapped him in the blanket from Asa's bed. The boy's hands steamed when they touched the warm tin of the stovepipe. The decision was not simple. If Milo left the tie shell and tried to reach the Tandy place in the blizzard, he might die on the prairie between here and there. If he sent Lem back with instructions, the boy might not survive the return trip. If he opened the door to the Tandys and brought them here, the trip would cost heat and risk everyone inside. But if Elsie Tandy died in a leaking sod house while Milo sat in a dry room a mile and a half away, the tie shell would have proved that a man could save himself and let a child drown. "Ruel knows the grade," Milo said. "If someone lights a fire at the south end of the shell, Ruel can follow the grade and find the light." Tolliff nodded. "I will keep the fire." Milo pulled his coat on and wrapped his face in a wool strip and took the lantern and walked out into the blizzard. He did not find the Tandys. The Tandys found him. Ruel had already decided to abandon the sod house. He had bundled Elsie in every quilt the family owned and put her on his back and started walking toward the grade with his wife and three other children in a line behind him, each holding the coat of the one in front. They had covered half a mile in 40 minutes when they saw the lantern light through the snow. The door opened. Heat dumped out. Snow swirled in. 6 people crowded into a room that was already tight with 3. Ruel fell inside with Elsie, limp on his back, his beard white with ice, his face the color of tallow. His wife knelt on the floor and unwrapped the child and held her against the warm tin of the heat shield and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the cold had not already said. If you're invested in this story, stay with it, because this is the moment when every lesson Milo learned either holds together or costs them the only warm room left on the draw. The room now held 10 people: Milo, Asa, Tolef, Ruel, Ruel's wife, Lem, 2 younger Tandy children, and Elsie. The stove was small. The woodpile was finite. The door had opened 3 times in an hour, and each opening had stolen heat that took 30 minutes to rebuild. Tolef took command of the fire, 1 split every 40 minutes, no exceptions. Asa counted the marks. The charcoal row on the wall grew slowly. The slowness was the point. Every mark was a measured expenditure, not panicked burn. At midnight, the south corner groaned. Not the rebuilt corner, the one Tolef had made Milo tear down and relay on stone. That corner held. The groan came from the south wall itself, where the drift outside had packed against the ties like a frozen river pressing a bridge pier. The weight of wind-driven snow against a 60-foot run of stacked timber created a lateral force that Milo had never calculated because he had not known he needed to. 1 spike sheared. Milo heard it, a sharp metallic pop, like a branch snapping in ice. Then silence. Then a second pop. Ruel looked at the wall. What was that? Pin's letting go, Tolef said. His voice was flat. The drift is loading the south face. The ties want to slide inward at the base. The room went quiet except for the wind. Elsie coughed. Asa held his charcoal still. Milo remembered the cribbing lesson. The corners locked under their own weight, but the mid-wall ties were held by pins and friction alone. If the snow load pushed hard enough, the middle ties could bow inward, opening the top seams, letting wind in, breaking the seal that kept the room above freezing. He grabbed the 1 cottonwood pole he had stored inside as a spare roof support. He braced it diagonally from the floor against the inner sill plate of the south wall, spreading the load across a wider surface. Ruel understood without being told. He took the second pole, a tie-moving skid, and braced the opposite angle. The groaning stopped. The poles flexed under pressure but held. Tolef checked the cloth strips near the south seams. 1 fluttered. He sealed the gap with a fistful of clay from the repair bucket, pressing it in with his thumb the way Milo's mother had pressed oakum into a rivershed 30 years ago and 1,000 miles away. The night continued. At 2 in the morning, the temperature outside dropped below 0. At 3, it was 10 below. At 4, Tolef estimated 20 below based on how fast ice formed on the nail heads protruding through the outer tie wall, a section foreman's trick that measured cold by the speed of frost. Inside, the room held. The stove burned low. Asa's marks on the wall showed 9 splits consumed since the door was last closed. 9 splits in 8 hours. The 4-cord woodpile outside had barely been touched. Elsie's breathing eased sometime before dawn, not because Milo had medicine, because the room was not full of wind-driven smoke and freezing meltwater and the kind of cold that fills a child's lungs with fluid. The air inside the tie shell was still and dry and above freezing, and for a 4-year-old with lung fever, that was the difference between getting worse and staying the same. By dawn, the snow had stopped. The wind had not. It drove what had already fallen into drifts that reached the lower edge of the sod roof over the air gap. The tie wall was black, wet, and still. Snow had packed against the north face to a depth of 3 feet, but the creosote surface shed it the way a waxed plank sheds water. The snow sat against the wall. It did not enter it. Milo opened the door at first light. The world was white and flat and scoured. The grade road had vanished. The mule was alive behind the east wall, its canvas tarp heavy with snow, its breath making small ghosts in the air. The abandoned siding was invisible. The horizon was invisible. The only vertical object for a mile in any direction was the black rectangle of the tie shell, standing in the white like a monolith. Ruel Tandy sat on the floor of the room with his daughter asleep in his lap and his back against the tie wall, and his face showing something that Milo had never seen on it before, which was the expression of a man rearranging what he knew about the world. He looked at the black wall behind him. He looked at the stove, burning its 10th split. He looked at the frost on the door frame and the dry air above the sleeping children and the cloth strips hanging motionless from the ceiling. He did not say it smelled like a rail yard. He did not say it looked like something a lunatic would build. He said, "How does it work?" And Milo, for the first time, did not have to defend the wall to someone who doubted it. He had to explain it to someone who wanted to understand. The blizzard held for 2 more days. The wind did not stop so much as exhaust itself, dropping from a roar to a moan to a whisper over the course of a long afternoon. When Milo opened the door on the morning of January 4th, the world outside looked like it had been remade in white plaster. Drifts reached the eaves of the sod roof on the north side. The grade road was buried. The mule stood behind the east wall, alive, its coat stiff with ice, chewing the last of the hay Milo had stored under the canvas. Ruel Tandy carried Elsie home that afternoon. The child was breathing better. Not well, her cough was deep and wet, the kind that would take weeks to leave. But she was alive, and her color had come back from the gray blue that had frightened her mother into silence. Ruel's wife thanked Milo at the door. Ruel did not thank him. He stood in the trampled snow outside the tie shell and looked at the structure the way a man looks at something he has been wrong about and is not yet finished being wrong about, because the wrongness has layers and he can see only the first one. "I will come back," Ruel said. "I have questions." He came back 3 days later with a notebook his wife used for keeping egg tallies. He had torn out the egg pages and written his own headings in pencil: wind, water, wood, heat, seams. He walked the perimeter of the tie shell the way Enoch Vale had walked it months ago, but where Enoch had measured weakness, Ruel was measuring success. He pressed his hand against the north wall where the drift had packed. The snow had melted from the creosote surface without soaking through. The ties were wet on the outside and dry on the inside. He ran his finger along a chinked seam. Solid. "How much wood did you burn?" Ruel asked. Milo took him inside and showed him Asa's marks on the wall. The charcoal row ran in 2 lines, one for the first day of the blizzard, one for the second. 43 splits total over approximately 50 hours of sustained burning, less than a third of a cord. Ruel counted the marks twice. "I burned 2 full cords in the same storm," he said, "and my south wall froze through by the second night. The water bucket was solid by midnight." "Your sod house breathes," Milo said. He did not say it with scorn. He said it the way Tolliff would have, as a measurement, not a judgment. "Wind finds the seams between the sod blocks. Every seam is a draft. Every draft carries heat out and cold in. The fire fights the wind, and the wind wins because the wind does not stop. And your wall does not breathe. The creosote seals the wood. The The clay seals the gaps. The air between the inner room and the outer shell does not move. Still air does not carry heat. The stove only has to warm the room, not replace what the wind steals. Ruel wrote in his notebook. He wrote for a long time. Then he looked at the heat shield, the stovepipe collar, the cloth strips hanging from the ceiling, the gravel trench visible through the doorway. "Can I seal the windward side of my sod house?" he asked. "Yes," Milo said. "You do not need railroad ties. You need to stop the air moving through the north wall. Planks over the worst seams. Clay daub pressed into every gap. A weighted door. A baffle inside the doorway so that wind does not enter in a straight line." He walked to the Tandy place that afternoon and helped Ruel start the work. They sealed the north face of the sod house with salvaged planks, nailed over the widest seams, and clay daub pressed into every crack with bare fingers. It took 2 days. The improvement was immediate. Ruel's wife reported that the stove held heat noticeably longer the first night, and the water bucket near the north wall took twice as long to freeze. Ruel did not call Milo a genius or a visionary. He called him the man who pays attention to wind. Coming from Ruel Tandy, that was as close to praise as the prairie allowed. Enoch Vale came to the claim on January 9th. He came alone, on the bay horse, with the carpenter's belt over the saddle horn and no particular expression on his face. He had spent the blizzard in town, moving between cabins, checking on settlers, tallying damage the way a quartermaster tallies supplies after a siege. He had seen frostbitten fingers and frozen water lines, and stovepipes choked with backdrafted smoke. He had found Hiram Voss, the bachelor on the claim north of the draw, alive but with 3 blackened toes and a cabin so full of frost that the walls glittered like the inside of an ice cave. Enoch tied his horse outside the tie shell and walked through the crib doorway and stood inside the room. He did not speak for a full minute. He pressed his hand against the inner wall. Dry. He pressed his hand against the stovepipe. Cool. The fire had been out for hours, but the room was still above freezing from residual warmth held by the mass of the ties. He looked at the charcoal marks on the wall. He counted them. 43 splits, Milo said, in 2.5 days. Yes. I found Hiram Voss burning through half his woodpile in the first 12 hours and still freezing water inside his cabin. Enoch turned and looked at the tie wall visible through the gap. The black surface was dry. The chinking was intact. The cloth strips hung motionless. I told you a cabin had to stop wind. You were right, Milo said. I was wrong about what could do it. He said it without ceremony. He did not apologize or shake Milo's hand or deliver a speech about being humbled. He was a carpenter. He had measured the result. The result had changed his assessment, and his assessment had changed his statement, and that was the end of it. But he did something else before he left. He stood in the doorway and looked at the tie shell from the outside, the black rectangle standing in the white prairie, the snow drifts reaching the eaves, the creosote surface shedding meltwater in dark streaks. And he said, I am bringing younger settlers here. I will tell them to ask you. Then I will tell them to put their hands where you tell them. It was not an endorsement. It was a referral. From Enoch Vale, it carried the weight of gospel. The weeks after the blizzard brought visitors the way a river flood brings driftwood, in clusters. Without warning, each one carrying questions that Milo had not expected to answer. The schoolmistress came first. Clara Emmett was 34 years old, unmarried, from a family of teachers in eastern Kansas. She had taught at the rail stop school for 3 years, and during the blizzard she had spent 2 days in the schoolhouse alone because the storm hit while the children were home and she could not reach her boarding room. The schoolhouse had a plank north wall with gaps wide enough to see daylight through, and a stove that consumed wood like a drunk consumes whiskey, fast, without satisfaction, and with nothing to show for it by morning. If another norther comes during the school day, Clara said, standing outside the tie shell with her coat buttoned to her throat and her hands in her pockets, I will have 14 children in a building that cannot keep them warm. Can you teach me how to seal it? I can show you how to find where the wind enters, Milo said. The rest is labor. He went to the schoolhouse that Saturday. He brought the candle stub and a bucket of clay and ash chinking mix. He held the candle near every seam in the north wall while Clara watched. The flame danced in 9 places. They sealed 7 of them with clay. The other 2 required planks that Milo did not have. Stuff cloth into those until spring, he told her. Rags soaked in tallow. The tallow seals the fiber, and the fiber blocks the draft. It is not permanent, but it will keep children breathing. Clara wrote everything in a small notebook, not an egg tally book like Ruel's, a proper notebook with a leather cover and lined pages. She wrote in a hand that was small and clean and organized, and Milo noticed that she wrote what he said rather than what she wanted to hear, which meant she was listening the way Tolef listened, for accuracy, not comfort. 2 section hands from the rail stop came next. They wanted to know who had given Milo permission to use the ties. Milo told them the truth. No one. The ties had been abandoned at a washed-out siding for years. He had taken property that no one claimed and no one wanted. The section hands were not satisfied, but they were not hostile. They reported the conversation to their foreman, and the foreman reported it to Sutter, and Sutter filed it away the way a man files a loaded cartridge, not for immediate use, but for the moment when the target holds still. Sutter's response to the blizzard's aftermath was not surrender. It was adaptation. He dropped the argument that the tie shell was not a habitable structure. The blizzard had proven it more habitable than half the dwellings in the district, and even Virgil Pruitt at the land office had heard the story of 10 people surviving in the Harrow cabin, while sod houses leaked and plank shacks froze. The habitability argument was dead. Sutter replaced it with a property argument. He claimed that the railroad ties belonged to the original contractor, a man named Denham who had abandoned the siding project in 1879. If the ties were Denham's property, then Milo had stolen them. If Milo had stolen them, the improvement was built with stolen materials. If the improvement was built with stolen materials, the claim was fraudulent. It was a thin argument. Denham had abandoned the siding 6 years ago and had not returned or communicated any claim to the ties. Abandoned property on public land was, by common practice, if not always clear law, available to anyone who hauled it away. But thin arguments could still reach a land agent's desk, and a land agent could still delay a proof hearing, and a delayed proof hearing could still give Sutter the window he needed to file a formal contest. Sutter wrote the letter in late January. He sent it to a land agent in Topeka named Bryce. The letter described the Harrow improvement as a structure assembled from materials of doubtful provenance, surrounded by timbers treated with a toxic preservative, injurious to the health of the claimant and his neighbors. Milo did not know about this letter either, but he knew Sutter was not finished because men like Sutter were never finished until the thing they wanted was in their hands or the person who held it was gone. Through February and March, Tolef and Milo worked the tie shell into a tighter structure. They built a small vestibule outside the main door, a 3-sided enclosure made from short tie pieces and sod, open on the windward end but angled so that the wind had to turn 2 corners before reaching the door. The vestibule cut heat loss during entry by half because the air inside it was still and cold rather than wind-driven and colder. They capped the top course of the outer wall with a layer of sod and clay, angled outward so that meltwater would run down the exterior face instead of seeping into the tie stack from above. Tolliff showed Milo how to mix clay with chopped buffalo grass and a handful of lime to create a cap that dried hard and resisted cracking through freeze-thaw cycles. They plastered the inside of the inner room with a fresh layer of mud and lime over the existing plank and sod wall. The plaster reduced the creosote smell that seeped through the air gap on warm days and created a cleaner surface that reflected stove heat back into the room instead of absorbing it. They cut 2 small vents through the upper wall, one on the north side, one on the south, with sliding wooden covers that Milo could open or close. The vents allowed stale air and smoke to escape without opening the door, and on still days they created a gentle cross draft that cleared the room of the close-heavy air that accumulated when 10 people had been breathing in a 12 by 14 space for 2 days. Each improvement was a lesson. Each lesson was Tolliff showing Milo something, and Milo understanding not just the action, but the principle behind it. "The cap is not decoration," Tolliff said, pressing the clay and grass mixture onto the top course. "Water enters from above more than from the side. Rain falls down, snow melts down. If the water enters the stack, it freezes between the ties and pushes them apart. The cap is not the last thing you build. It is the most important thing you build." "The vents are not windows," Tolliff said, fitting the sliding covers into grooves he had cut with a chisel. "A window is a hole you look through. A vent is a hole you control. The difference is the cover. If you cannot close it in 30 seconds, it is a window, and in January, a window will kill you." They worked well together. Not easily. Tolliff was impatient and precise, and Milo was stubborn and experimental, and they disagreed about methods the way 2 carpenters always disagree, which is loudly and with specific measurements. "The cap needs to overhang 2 inches, Tolliff said. 1 inch is enough. The water falls straight." "Water does not fall straight when wind carries it. 2 inches. 2 inches of overhang means the cap weighs more, which means the top course compresses more, which means the chinking cracks sooner." Tolliff looked at him. The look was the one a teacher gives a student who has made a good argument for the wrong conclusion. "You're thinking like a builder. Think like water. Water wants to go inside. Water will use the wind to reach places you did not plan for. 2 inches. Milo built the 2-inch overhang. 3 weeks later, a driving rain hit the south wall at a steep angle. The 1-inch test section Milo had left on the east wall as an experiment leaked. The 2-inch overhang shed every drop. "I did not say it to be right," Tolliff said. "I said it because I once watched a bridge fail because I trusted weight but ignored water. The bridge was strong. The water was patient. The water won." Milo did not argue again about overhangs. Tolliff began to slow in march. The limp that had always favored his right side grew heavier. He arrived later in the mornings and left earlier in the afternoons. He sat more and stood less, and when he stood, he held the cant hook not as a tool but as a crutch. His breath came shorter on cold days, and he coughed in a way that sounded like it came from a place deeper than his lungs. Milo did not ask. Tolliff did not explain. They worked the way they had always worked, side by side, correcting each other, arguing about measurements. But the arguments grew shorter because Tolliff did not have the breath for long ones. In late March, a section of the railroad culvert a mile east of the claim washed out during a sudden thaw. The drainage channel flooded, and the road to the rail stop became impassable. Tolliff insisted on walking out to inspect the damage because he had built culverts, and he could not let a bad one stand without seeing why it failed. He came back wet to the waist and gray in the face. Milo made him sit by the stove and drink hot water with sugar. Tolliff drank it and said nothing for a long time. The culvert failed because the base stones shifted, Tolliff said finally. The same problem as your south corner. Water underneath. It is always water underneath. You should not have walked out there. You should not have built a house from railroad ties. We do what we do. He grew worse through the first week of April. Milo found him one morning at the tie shell, alone, rebuilding a corner joint where the spring thaw had softened the clay chinking. Tolliff's hands were shaking. Snow melt ran across the ground and soaked his boots, and he was pressing fresh clay into the seam with fingers that did not close properly. A wall is not what stands, Tolliff said. He did not look at Milo. He was talking to the wall, or to himself, or to someone Milo could not see. A wall is what still stands after water argues. Milo took the clay from his hands and finished the joint. Tolliff leaned against the tie wall and watched, and his breathing sounded like wind through a cracked seam. Tolliff Asen died on a Wednesday morning in the second week of April. He died in his own room at the boarding house in the rail stop, not on the prairie, not in the cold, not in any dramatic fashion that the story would prefer. He died because his body had been used hard for 63 years and it was finished, and because the walk to the washed culvert had taken something from his lungs that his lungs could not replace. Milo learned about it from the boarding house owner, who rode out to the claim because Tolliff had told him, weeks earlier, that if anything happened, Harrow should get the tools. The tools arrived in a canvas roll, a cant hook with a handle worn smooth by decades of grip, a draw knife, a file, a carpenter's square with the initials TA burned into the wood at the corner, a small level with a brass bubble that Tolliff had carried in his coat pocket every day Milo had known him. Milo laid the tools on the sleeping platform and looked at them for a long time. Asa sat beside him and did not speak because the boy understood silence better than most adults, having lived inside it since his mother died. The knowledge that Tolliff had carried was not in the tools. It was in the way he held the candle near a seam and read the flame. It was in the way he pressed his thumb into clay and knew by feel whether the mix was right. It was in the argument about the 2-inch overhang and the bridge that failed because a man trusted weight but ignored water. Knowledge, Milo thought, could feel heavier than timber. Timber you set down. Knowledge you carried until you gave it away, or it carried you into the ground. He hung the square beside the door, where the initials faced the room. He put the level in his coat pocket, where Tolliff had kept it. He picked up the cant hook, and it fit his hand as if it had been waiting. The secondary crisis came in May, and it came as water. 3 days of steady rain in the third week of May swelled every draw and drainage channel in the district. The shallow creek that ran through the bottom of the draw rose 2 feet overnight, then 3 feet, then spilled over its banks and spread across the low ground in a brown flood that carried fence posts and dead grass and the particular smell of prairie soil when it has absorbed more water than it can hold. The schoolhouse sat on low ground. Clara Emmett had chosen the site 3 years earlier because it was central to the district's families, but central meant low, and low meant water, and by the second afternoon of rain, the north wall of the schoolhouse was standing in 6 inches of moving water. The foundation stones had shifted. The plank wall was taking moisture through every gap that Clara and Milo had not sealed. And there were still 2 gaps stuffed with tallow-soaked cloth that were never meant to survive a flood. 14 children were inside. The rain had started during the school day, and by the time it became a flood, the road south was underwater, and the road north was blocked by Sutter's cattle, which had broken through a temporary fence and crowded onto the high ground in a mass of mud and panic. Clara sent her oldest student, a boy of 13, running to the Harrow claim. Milo heard the situation and did not hesitate. He took the cant hook and the iron wedge and a coil of rope and ran the 1.5 miles to the schoolhouse in boots that sank ankle-deep in mud with every step. What he found when he arrived was a building dying the way Tolef had described, not from force, but from patience. The water was not smashing the wall. It was seeping through it, finding every gap, every shifted stone, every poorly joined plank, and entering the building the way wind entered a leaky cabin, invisibly, steadily, and with complete indifference to the people inside. The north wall was bowing inward at the base. The foundation stones had moved half an inch, and half an inch was enough. Water ran across the floor in shallow rivers that the children were standing on the benches to avoid. Clara stood at the north wall with her hands pressed against the planks, as if she could hold the building together through force of will. Milo saw the problem the way Tolef would have seen it. Not the water inside, that was a symptom. The problem was the water outside, pressing against the base of the north wall, undermining the foundation, and threatening to push the wall inward until the roof joists lost their seat and the whole structure folded. He needed to divert the water around the building. Not stop it. You could not stop a flood with your hands, but you could give it a path that did not go through the wall. "I need every man who can lift," Milo said. He said it to Clara, but he said it loud enough for the people who had gathered on the high ground to hear Ruel Tandy, two section hands, the storekeeper Loomis, and a handful of settlers who had come to help but did not know what to do. They came down the slope. Milo organized them into a line. He sent 3 men to the abandoned grade to drag back short tie pieces, the broken and split ties he had left behind because they were too damaged to use in the shell. They came back with 7 pieces, each 4 to 5 feet long, blackened and heavy. Milo laid the tie pieces in a V shape on the uphill side of the north wall, with the point of the V facing upstream. The ties acted as a diversion wall, a crude cribbing that split the water flow and sent it around both sides of the schoolhouse, instead of pressing directly against the foundation. It was Tolef's bridge logic applied to a building. You did not fight the water. You gave the water somewhere else to go. Ruel brought sandbags, feed sacks filled with gravel and dirt. Milo stacked them behind the tie pieces to seal the gaps. The water pushed against the diversion and found the easier path around the corners. The pressure on the north wall dropped. The bowing stopped. Clara worked beside him in water up to her knees. She did not ask what to do. She watched what he did and did the same thing 2 feet to his left, packing sandbags with the same steady, focused energy she brought to teaching children their letters. Her hands were red and raw, and she did not stop. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because by then, Milo's strange wall was no longer just his shelter. It had become something the whole settlement could learn from. They braced the foundation with flat stones and timber wedges driven under the shifted base. They sealed the 2 remaining wall gaps with clay and rags. They cleared the floor water by cutting a shallow drainage channel through the south wall, a controlled exit that let the standing water flow out instead of rising. By evening, the rain had slowed. The creek was still high, but the diversion held. The children were dry. The schoolhouse was damaged, but standing. Milo sat on the wet ground outside the north wall with the cant hook across his knees and his coat soaked through and his boots full of water. Clara sat beside him. She did not thank him, which he appreciated because thanks would have made it a favor, and it was not a favor. It was the thing you did when you knew how water worked and other people did not. "You learned this from the Norwegian," Clara said. "Some of it. The rest I learned from my mother." "What did she teach you?" "That wind quits where water quits." Clara wrote it in her notebook. She wrote it on the first clean page, in letters larger than her usual hand, and underlined it twice. Sutter did not come to the schoolhouse. His cattle had blocked the north road. His temporary fence had failed because he had not set the posts deep enough. and the flood had loosened the ground around them until they fell. The cattle, panicked by rising water, had crowded onto the road in a herd that no wagon could pass. 14 children were trapped in a flooding schoolhouse because Claiborne Sutter had built a cheap fence. Nobody said this out loud. They did not need to. The connection was visible to everyone who had spent the afternoon standing in knee-deep water, while Sutter's cattle stood on dry ground a quarter-mile away. Sutter rode to the schoolhouse the next morning after the water receded and found Milo and Clara and Ruel finishing the foundation repairs. He sat on his horse and watched them work and said nothing for a long time. "I heard the building nearly went," Sutter said finally. "It would have gone without the ties," Clara said. She did not look up from the stone she was setting. Sutter looked at the black tie pieces angled against the north wall. The same material he had called junk. The same material he had argued was a nuisance. The same material that had diverted a flood away from 14 children while his cattle blocked the only road out. He did not apologize. He did not acknowledge the connection between his fence and the blocked road. He turned his horse and rode back toward his leased pasture, and Milo watched him go and knew that the contest papers were still on a desk in Topeka and the fight was not over. But something had shifted. Not in Sutter. Sutter was the same man he had always been, calculating, self-interested, immune to shame that did not come with a price tag. The shift was in the community. The people who had stood in the water and carried the ties and packed the sandbags had seen what the method could do when applied fast, under pressure by a man who understood it. They had also seen who had not come and why. Sutter's power was not in his money. It was in the assumption that money made him right. The flood had not taken his money. It had taken the assumption. In the weeks after the flood, Milo became something he had not intended to become, a teacher. Enoch Vale brought a young couple to the claim, newlyweds from Ohio who had filed on a quarter section east of the draw and were building their first structure from green cottonwood and hope. Enoch stood by the tie shell and said, "Ask him. Then put your hands where he tells you." Milo showed them the candle test. He showed them the clay and ash chinking mix. He showed them the drainage trench. He showed them the cloth draft strips and the sliding vents and the weighted door. He showed them the heat shield and the stovepipe collar and the rule about never letting treated wood touch flame. The young man asked if he should use railroad ties. Milo said no. Use what you have. The ties are not the lesson. The lesson is seal the wind, shed the water, spend the fuel last. You can do that with sod and planks and clay if you do it right. Clara asked Milo to teach a winter preparation class at the schoolhouse in September. She wanted every family in the district to understand the basic principles before the next winter arrived. Milo said yes, then stood in the doorway of his cabin that night with Tullif's square hanging beside his head, and wondered when he had stopped being a man trying to survive and started being a man other people asked for help. The answer was the blizzard. The answer was Ruel pounding on the door. The answer was Elsie breathing easier in a room that did not leak. The answer was Tullif, who had recognized something in a man lifting a railroad tie with a wagon hub fulcrum and had decided that poor could be taught. By the autumn of 1886, Milo Harrow's claim had become a place people visited before they built. Not because the tie shell was beautiful. It was not. It stood on the prairie like a black scar on white skin, angular, tar-stained, smelling of creosote on warm days and damp clay on cold ones. The sod cap had gone green with buffalo grass by September, so the structure looked like a dark box wearing a crown of weeds. Children still called it the tar pen, though now they said it with something closer to curiosity than mockery. People came because Enoch Vale sent them, and because Ruel Tandy told them to, and because Clara Emmett wrote letters to families in the district explaining what Milo had learned and what he was willing to teach. A typical visit went like this. A new settler arrived at the claim in a wagon with a confused expression and a piece of paper with Milo's name on it. Milo walked them around the tie shell and let them touch it. He let them feel the difference between the creosote surface and the inner wall. He showed them the air gap. He showed them the gravel trench, the cribbed corners, the clay chinking, the cloth draft strips, the sliding vents, the heat shield. Then he took them inside and lit the candle. He held the flame near every seam and showed them how to read it. Still flame meant sealed. Bent flame meant draft. He made them hold the candle themselves. He made them press their hands against the seams and feel for air they could not see. Your eyes will tell you a wall is finished, Milo said. The candle will tell you the truth. He did not charge for the lesson. He did not accept payment in goods or labor. When Ruel asked him why, Milo said, Tolef did not charge me. Ruel said, Tolef had a pension from the railroad. Tolef had a pension, Milo said, and I have neighbors. The value is the same. This was not entirely true. The value was not the same because Milo was still poor and neighbors did not buy flour. But Milo understood something that poverty had taught him and generosity had confirmed. A man who teaches his neighbors to survive the winter does not starve alone in the spring. The knowledge came back in ways that were not money, but were worth more than money. Ruel's wife sending cornbread and salt pork when the flour ran low. Clara bringing school books for Asa. Enoch leaving a set of square-cut nails on the doorstep without a note. The section hands looking the other way when Milo hauled scrap timber from the rail stop. By the time Milo taught his winter preparation class at the schoolhouse in September, he had visitors' questions organized into a pattern. The pattern was Tolef's pattern, though Milo did not realize it until he heard himself speaking the words in the same order Tolef had taught them. First, drainage. Move the water before it freezes. Second, seams. Find every draft with a candle, seal it with clay and fiber. Third, mass. The heavier the windward wall, the slower the heat escapes. Sod, stone, timber, railroad ties. The material mattered less than the weight. Fourth, separation. Keep the fire away from treated wood. Keep the stove away from the wall. Keep an air gap between the living room and the weather. Fifth, discipline. Burn less, burn slower, count the splits. The fire that roars is the fire that runs out. 12 families attended the class. Clara recorded their names in her ledger. 6 of them made improvements to their dwellings before the first frost. 3 of them used the candle test and found drafts they had not known existed. One of them, the young couple from Ohio whom Enoch had brought to the claim, sealed their north wall so thoroughly that their first Kansas winter cost them less than 3 cords of wood, a number that astonished Ruel Tandy, who had burned 5 the previous year even with his own improvements. The knowledge was spreading. Not fast. Knowledge never moves fast on a frontier where people are busy surviving, but steadily, the way water moves downhill. One seam at a time, one candle, test at a time. One family at a time. The letter from the land agent in Topeka arrived in October. It was addressed to Virgil Pruitt at the land office in Dodge City, and it said that Bryce had reviewed Sutter's contest claim and found insufficient grounds for a formal hearing. The abandoned siding had been inactive for 6 years. No party had asserted ownership of the remaining materials. The improvement on the Harrow claim constituted a habitable dwelling meeting the requirements of the Homestead Act, and the use of salvaged materials was consistent with the practice of settlement. Pruitt rode out to the claim and delivered the letter himself. He was a small man who took pleasure in delivering good news because the rest of his job required him to deliver the other kind. Sutter's contest is dismissed, Pruitt said. Your claim stands. Milo read the letter twice. The words were formal and bloodless, the language of a bureaucracy that did not know or care what it had cost to stack 240 railroad ties by hand with a lame mule in a Kansas summer. But the meaning was clear. The land was his. The tie shell was legal. Sutter had lost. Milo folded the letter and put it inside the tobacco tin where he had kept his money. The tin had held $14.30 when he arrived. Now it held a piece of paper that said the land was his and $2.11 that was all that remained of everything else. Asa asked what the letter said. Milo told him. The boy looked at the tie wall and then at the square hanging beside the door and then at his father, and for the first time since Nell died, his face held an expression that was not grief or silence or endurance. It was something that looked, from a certain angle, like the beginning of safety. But Sutter was not finished, because losing an argument in Topeka was not the same as losing an argument in his own mind. The late autumn brought another test, not a blizzard. The winter of 1886 to 87 was milder than the last, and the January that arrived was cold but survivable. The test came in November in the form of a fast-moving sleet storm that caught the district by surprise on a Wednesday afternoon. Sutter's cattle operation ran a line shack on the western edge of his leased pasture, 4 miles from town. The shack was built the way cheap shacks were always built on leased land. Thin planks, loose joints, a roof that kept rain out most of the time and snow out none of the time. 2 hired boys worked the line shack through the winter, checking fences and feeding cattle. They were 17 and 15, brothers from a farm family near Garden City who needed the wages. The sleet storm hit while the boys were inside the shack. The wind drove freezing rain through every seam in the north wall. The stove could not keep pace. By nightfall, the temperature inside the shack was below freezing, and the boys had burned through their 2-day wood supply, trying to fight what the wind was stealing through the walls. Sutter rode to town at dawn and demanded help. He stood in the general store and told the men gathered around the stove that his hired boys were trapped in a line shack that was taking weather, and that someone needed to ride out with wood and supplies. The men looked at each other. Some of them had stood in knee-deep water at the schoolhouse while Sutter's cattle blocked the road. Some of them had watched Sutter file contest papers against a man whose shelter had saved 10 lives. Some of them had heard Sutter call the tie shell junk and a nuisance and a fire hazard. No one volunteered. Ruel Tandy spoke first. "Those are boys, Sutter, not your argument with Harrow." "Then ride out," Sutter said. "I did not build the shack," Ruel said. "You did." The silence lasted long enough for the stove to pop twice. Then Milo, who had been standing near the door buying flour, set his sack on the counter and said, "I will go." Ruel looked at him. "You do not owe that man anything." "I do not owe him," Milo said, "but they are boys." He did not say the rest, because the rest was private, that if he let 2 boys freeze in a bad shack because their employer was his enemy, he would become the kind of man who let a child drown while sitting in a dry room, and that was the one thing the tie shell was never meant to prove. Milo rode out with Enoch Vale, who came because he was a man who could not hear about a failing structure without needing to see it. They brought rope, canvas, planks from the rail stop, and 2 of the short tie pieces left over from the schoolhouse diversion. The line shack was worse than Milo expected. The north wall was not just leaking, it was separating at the base, where the foundation had never been set in stone, and the frost had heaved the bottom plank 2 inches out of alignment. The roof edge on the windward side had lifted, and sleet was driving through the gap in a fine spray that coated everything inside with a thin glaze of ice. The stove was cold. The boys were huddled in the corner under every blanket they had, alive but shaking. Milo saw the same mistakes he had seen in his own half-built shack 15 months ago. Unsealed seams, no wind baffle at the door, no drainage at the foundation. A roof edge that no one had weighted or secured. A stove placed against the wall without a heat shield, so the tin radiated warmth outward through the planks as fast as the fire produced it. He and Enoch worked for 3 hours. They braced the separated north wall with planks nailed across the gap. They set the 2 tie pieces as windbreak anchors against the base, blocking the worst of the draft. They weighted the roof edge with stones lashed to rope. They sealed the door with canvas and built a baffle from scrap boards that forced the wind to turn before it reached the stove. They relit the fire. By the time they finished, the shack was not warm. It would never be warm. It was built wrong from its first nail. But it was survivable. The boys stopped shaking. The stove held heat long enough for the air inside to rise above freezing. Sutter arrived while they were finishing. He had ridden the 4 miles from town with a load of firewood on a borrowed wagon, which was the minimum a man could do when other men were saving his employees with their hands. Milo was outside the shack, driving a stake to anchor one of the tie pieces. Sutter dismounted and stood beside him and watched him work. The tie piece was black with creosote. The stake was a salvaged rail spike. The smell of tar rose in the cold air. "Hold this," Milo said, and handed Sutter the rope. Sutter took it. He held the rope while Milo drove the stake. The rope was wet with creosote residue, and Sutter's gloves darkened with the same black tar he had mocked in the general store, the same black tar he had called junk, the same black tar that was holding his line shack together while his hired boys ate the first hot food they had tasted in 36 hours. They stood there in the sleet, and Sutter looked at his blackened gloves, and then at the tie piece anchored against the wall, and then at Milo. "I called it junk," Sutter said. "It was," Milo said, "until it had a job." Sutter pulled the gloves off and looked at the tar stains on his fingers. He did not smile. He did not offer his hand. He was not a man who converted to warmth. He was a man who recognized when an argument had been lost so thoroughly that continuing it would cost him more than conceding. "I will withdraw the contest," Sutter said. "It has already been dismissed." "Then I will stop talking about it." He mounted his horse and rode back toward town, and the sleet darkened his coat and the wind pushed at his back, and he did not look at the tie piece again. But he stopped talking about it. He never mentioned the claim or the ties or the fire hazard to anyone in the district again. He did not become Milo's friend. He did not become his ally. He became what he had always been, a businessman, but a businessman who had learned that some kinds of junk have more value than the man who names them. Clara Emmett brought the ledger to the claim on a Sunday afternoon in late November. She had been keeping it since September, a record of every household in the district that had adopted some part of Milo's method. She sat at the table inside the tie shell, which Milo had built from salvaged planks and sanded smooth with a piece of limestone, and opened the ledger to the first page. 14 households listed. Next to each name, Clara had written what they had done. Sealed north wall, dug drainage trench, installed door baffle, built heat shield, hung draft strips, counted wood splits. Some had done one thing, some had done 5. The young couple from Ohio had done all 6 and added a 7th, a vestibule like Milo's, built from sod and scrap plank. "This is not your record," Clara said. "It is theirs, but it started here." Milo looked at the names. He recognized all of them. He had visited most of their homes. He had held the candle near their walls and shown them where the wind lived. "Tolliff should see this," he said. "He does," Clara said. She did not mean it as mysticism. She meant that the knowledge Tolliff had given Milo was now in 14 households and would be in more by spring, and that was the only form of survival a dead man could achieve. She closed the ledger and left it on the table. Milo looked at it for a long time after she left. The leather cover was plain. The handwriting inside was clean and careful. The pages smelled like ink and the faintest trace of chalk dust from the schoolhouse. He had not expected to feel anything about a list of names in a notebook, but the list meant something that the tie shell alone did not. The tie shell had saved his family. The list meant the idea had outgrown the cabin. Courtship on the Kansas prairie in 1887 did not involve flowers or poetry or any of the things that stories prefer. It involved labor. Milo and Clara sealed the schoolhouse together in September, working side by side for 3 days, pressing clay into seams and hanging draft strips, and building a wind baffle for the schoolhouse door that the older students helped construct as a lesson in practical geometry. They argued about the placement of the vents. Clara wanted them higher, Milo wanted them lower, and the argument had the texture of two people who respected each other's competence enough to disagree with energy. They recorded the district storm preparations together in October, walking from homestead to homestead with the ledger, checking doors and walls and foundations. Clara wrote. Milo tested. Asa came along and held the candle at the seams because the boy had inherited his father's hands and his mother's patience, and tall of sigh for where the flame bent. They taught the winter preparation class together in the schoolhouse, and the children made their own draft strips from flour sacking and hung them in the classroom. And one child, a girl of 8 named Daphne Tandy, Ruel's second daughter, asked if she could take one home and hang it near her bed so she could watch it while she slept. If it moves, what does that mean? Milo asked. Wind is coming in, Daphne said. And what do? Tell my pa to bring the clay bucket. Milo looked at Clara. Clara looked at Milo. The exchange lasted less than a second, but it contained the recognition that they were building something together that was not a wall or a school or a storm plan. It was the thing that happens when two people discover that the work they do alone is better when they do it beside each other. They married in the spring of 1888. The ceremony was at the schoolhouse, officiated by a circuit preacher who had ridden 60 miles and wanted to be finished before the afternoon rain. Ruel Tandy stood as witness. Enoch Vale brought a set of hinges he had forged himself, proper iron hinges for a proper door, because the tie shell's original door hung on rope loops, and Enoch had disapproved of it since the first time he visited. Clara moved into the claim. The 12 by 14 room was tight for 2 adults and a boy, but tight had saved them, and they did not complain about what tight had cost. The years compressed, as years do when the story's engine shifts from survival to living. Milo improved the inner house. He added a second room by extending the original frame south inside the tie shell, using lumber he bought with money earned from fence work and mule driving and the occasional dollar paid by a settler who insisted on compensating him for a building consultation despite Milo's refusal. He never got rich. He never wanted to. He wanted the land, and the land wanted work, and the exchange was honest. He planted cottonwood saplings along the north side of the claim, knowing he would not benefit from their wind-breaking height for a decade, but knowing also that Asa would, and that a man who plants trees he will not sit under has made a specific kind of peace with time. Clara kept the ledger. By the winter of 1888, 23 households had adopted some part of the storm method. Not all used railroad ties, most did not. They used sod and stone and planks and whatever heavy material they could find to build mass on the windward side. They chinked with clay and ash. They hung draft strips and taught their children to read the candle flame. They counted splits. Clara added a north wall list to the schoolhouse routine each September. Children wrote what their families had fixed before first frost: door baffle, roof edge, chinking, wood count, water bucket placement. The list became a competition. Families who completed every item earned no prize except the knowledge that their house was ready, which was the only prize the prairie offered. Asa grew into a young man with his father's hands and his mother's silence and Tolef's understanding of timber. He left the claim at 17 to work section repair for the Santa Fe, not because he loved railroads, but because he understood wood and weight, and the way heavy things behaved when you moved them with intelligence instead of force. He sent home discarded hardware rather than money, bent spikes, scrap iron, worn tie plates, because he knew what his father could do with metal, and metal was worth more to Milo than the dollars it would have cost to buy. Milo kept Tolef's square hanging beside the door. He kept the level in his coat pocket. The cant hook leaned against the east wall of the tie shell, its handle worn smooth by two men's grip. On winter nights, when the stove burned low and the cloth strips hung still and the black walls held the cold at bay, Milo would sometimes put his palm against the inner wall and feel the stillness the way his mother had taught him to feel a sealed seam, with his whole hand, not just his fingers. The ties aged. The creosote surface, which had been wet black and sharp-smelling in 1885, weathered to a dry gray black by the early 90s. The edges silvered. Cracks opened in the end grain where the oak had dried beyond what the preservative could hold. The chinking needed repair each spring, and the sod cap needed reseeding, and the drainage trench needed clearing after every major rain. But the walls stood. They settled a quarter-inch in the first decade and held. The cribbed corners locked tighter as the weight compressed. The black wood did not rot. The black wood did not let the water in. One afternoon in 1893, an older Enoch Vale rode up to the claim with a young man behind him on a roan horse. The young man was fresh from Illinois, 22 years old, with a new claim receipt and the particular confidence of someone who had never been tested by anything larger than his own ambition. Enoch dismounted and walked the young man around the tie shell the way he had walked it himself 8 years earlier, except that this time he did not measure weakness. He measured what had lasted. The young man looked at the silvered black walls and the green sod cap and the vestibule and the drainage trench and the cribbed corners. He looked at the door with its iron hinges and the square with the burned initials hanging beside it. He looked at the candle sitting on a shelf near the entrance, its wick blackened, its base ringed with old wax. He laughed, not cruelly, nervously, the way a man laughs when he does not understand what he is looking at and does not want to admit it. Enoch looked at him. "Laugh after January," he said. The young man stopped laughing. Something in Enoch's voice, the flatness, the weight of a man who had counted the dead and measured the living and knew exactly what a wall was worth, closed the laugh the way a hand closes over a candle flame. "Go inside," Enoch said. "Ask Harrow. Then put your hands where he tells you." Milo Harrow died on a morning in early April, decades later, in the room he had built inside the tie shell on a quarter-section claim 9 miles west of the rail stop. He died in spring weather, not winter. The cottonwoods he had planted were tall enough to bend in the wind. Clara was beside him. The stove was cold because the day was warm, and the cloth strips hung still because there was no draft to move them. Tolef's square still hung beside the door. The candle still sat on the shelf. The tie walls still stood. He was buried beside Nell, outside the old claim line, under a limestone slab that Asa had cut and carved with letters deep enough that rain would not wear them smooth. Destitute. By the next winter after the blizzard of 1886, 14 households in the district had copied some part of Milo Harrow's storm method. Not all used railroad ties. Some used sod, stone, scrap plank, or salvaged bridge timber. The lesson was not the material, it was the principle. Seal the wind, shed the water, spend the fuel last. Clara Emmett's school ledger contained a north wall list where children wrote what their families fixed before first frost, door baffle, roof edge, chinking, wood count, water bucket placement. And a girl named Daphne Tandy checked the draft strip beside her bed every night before she slept. Milo remained on the claim. He improved the inner house, planted cottonwoods, and kept Tollef's square hanging beside the door with the initials facing the room. Asa worked section repair and sent home discarded hardware rather than money because he knew what his father could do with iron. Clara kept the ledger until the pages were full, then started a second one. Milo never became wealthy. He became useful, which on the Kansas prairie was the harder thing and the better one. On a night in January when the sky went black to the north and sleet struck the tie wall in sheets and the stove burned low on its counted splits, the room held. 10 people had crowded inside during the worst blizzard western Kansas had seen in years, and the water bucket against the far wall never froze solid. The black ties stood wet and silent while wind clawed over them. Ruel Tandy had called it a tar coffin. Sutter had called it junk. The children had called it the tar pen. Milo had called it nothing because he did not name things. He built them. And inside the room, his son slept with one hand open beside the bucket, and on the wall behind him the charcoal marks counted 9 splits through the night, and on the shelf the candle waited for the next seam that needed testing. Years later, a child at Clara's school ran her finger along the words written on the first clean page of the ledger. Wind quits where water quits. And on the Kansas prairie, that was sometimes the difference between a cabin and a grave.